wanted to quickly take a second to frame ICT in education. We've heard ICT education, ICT in education, ICT4 education. The difference I see it as, ICT education is students learning to program or use software applications. ICT in education is inserting ICT into the teaching and learning process. But ICT4 education, I think, is sort of the thrust of my presentation here, and it's really inclusive of the elements of ICT education as well as ICT in education. And I think it's rooted in this view that ICT is a tool to support education, and typically it combines appropriate ICT into broader approaches. So by appropriate, I just wanted to define that ICT is not just computers. We're talking about mobile technologies in some of the most rural, remote areas, even radio, looking at the whole gamut of ICT. Should I just continue? Yeah, in the interest of time. I put out some of our ADB propaganda up front there. It's good practice in ICT. It's a little bit of an outdated publication, but I think the principles in it still remain effective. And just wanted to highlight a few key ideas that come out of some of the three rationale for why we should be promoting ICT in education is really, as societies move toward a knowledge economy, of course it makes a lot of sense. Let me just see what my slide is. Oh, there it is. Okay. Sorry. So yeah, we're working to produce information literate, ICT capable labor force. And from the pedagogical standpoint, you've heard a lot from my colleagues before, I won't go into that. And really the last important thing is the issue of equity. And I think that's where ICT can be incredibly transformative and powerful. Keeping in mind the nature of the Pacific region, I think there's a lot of potential there, as was highlighted by many of the presenters earlier. However, if we look at the international evidence, as was, I think, raised by UNICEF earlier, yes, unfortunately, the evidence of impact is very mixed. Tricano from World Bank, a big education technology guru, has said that there are very tentative conclusions in this area. And maybe on balance, we would say that there's a lot of promise, but there is also a lot of pitfalls. And so what we want to make sure is that we develop that evidence base that we need so desperately to make sure that we're investing in the most strategic way possible. And so I would say for a lesson for all of us here is to really think about the metrics of how we measure ICT4E, how we're measuring learning outcomes first and foremost, but there are a whole bunch of other considerations that we need to look at. And we also really need to be cautious, approaching ICT investments from a very strategic point that emphasizes outcomes, equity, and sustainability. An ADB publication in 2007 showed us that most of our investments in ICT infrastructure and development had best success rates when there was already a very strong sector plan that addressed ICT policy and strategy options. Other things to consider, of course, are the localization or contextualization of content and making sure that it's relevant to the local population. And another thing that gets underplayed is really the total cost of ownership of ICT for education, and really looking at efficiency and cost-sharing options, but also looking at the upfront costs as well as the maintenance costs and the ongoing. We can go on and on and on. But people don't really take that into account up front, and I think that's something that we need to look at more. Obviously, capacity development and resource needs are very critical areas, especially in the Pacific, where human capacity development is a real challenge at times. So I'd say approaching this from an education point of view, we need to focus on education targets, not hardware targets, looking at the education challenges and the realities, versus a preconceived idea that this technology needs to be in the classroom. And that the ICT approach or intervention needs to be integrated into a broader approach, and not just be viewed as a separate ICT laboratory, but really think about how ICT can be integrated into, for example, subject matter learning. Critical to the success of ICT, we found, is stakeholder buy-in, as in any initiative. So when we look at the opportunity costs, we're looking at things like, well, one computer, or should we buy an X number of books? In some countries, one computer can be the cost of half of a year's salary of a teacher. So you need to weigh those things very important. Similarly, as I mentioned, recurring costs on internet, maintenance, replacement. In the instance of the Samoa SchoolNet, we were able to leverage some of the efforts actually of the DFAT-MFAT project in Samoa, which is the secondary school grant fee scheme, where they loosened up the requirements around that grant and allowed for electricity costs to be paid using the grant. Those kinds of things. We also did a medium-term expenditure framework to kind of rationalize the cost of the ICT investment over time. And those worked out favorably, and so it gave us greater confidence. I think that the big issue is on human resources, and that's something that I think all governments need to consider very carefully up front. For the Pacific, it's a pretty much a no-brainer that sustainability comes first. But I would say, as a guide, just plan on the equipment breaking down. Plan on your consultants leaving, and plan on the novelty of any gadget wearing off. And those are the things, if you plan for that, you'll be much better prepared. So I would say, as a note of caution, that perhaps the best technology is the one that you already have, the one that you already use. In Solomon Islands, we'll be looking at piloting some technology, probably using mobile, just because of the wide coverage of mobile phones in the rural and remote areas. So not always necessarily going for the fancy tablets or so forth, but really thinking about what's locally relevant. And as I mentioned before, ensuring a comprehensive approach. So just in the Samoa SchoolNet program, the interesting thing about that is that the e-learning resources did not depend on internet, and internet was not widely available in Samoa still. So it really, the resources are housed on one server in the school, so everybody has access to the resources. And I thought something very interesting about that was that you didn't have the downside risk of the internet not working, or the risky content that is available on the internet. So it was actually a very good transition into introducing computers in secondary schools there. So it'll be interesting to see when the internet does eventually come, how they'll navigate that. But I think on the content side, you want to make sure that you have a diversity of suppliers on content. We went in Samoa with one vendor, which had a number of resources. There were 28,000 different e-learning resources available. But I think ideally you also want to complement that, make sure that there's local content contextualized, so building that capacity within the government, or ensuring that that continually develops. Then we also want to plan for the total cost of learning. I think we went into this earlier. Community outreach is a really important issue on any initiative that we undertake in the education sector, but I think particularly when dealing with ICT. In Samoa, I had spoken with some families who were not necessarily clued in on the internet and a little bit skeptical about it. So we have to respect these issues in traditional villages and make sure that we do the proper socialization and awareness raising when we're introducing something so radically new. One more issue is on follow-up. We've heard it all, I think, before about policies and implementation and lack thereof, but particularly when you're dealing with IT, there's a responsibility to follow up and monitor and make sure that we are doing our due diligence in terms of capturing what is that value added. Whether it be learning outcomes or behavioral changes, qualitative information about student behavior as a result of the e-learning resources, those are vital information that we need for our evidence base. Because without the evidence base, we don't know if this is a smart investment. One of the experiences under Samoa SchoolNet too was that we recognized that actually competencies for IT are a very important issue that needs to be raised within teacher professional standards. We also looked at integrating those into the pre-service teacher education program at the UNS. Some of the challenges to watch out for are human resource capacity and making sure that you have enough people who are IT capable, and that you also have IT champions within the ministry, within the schools. And then, as I've mentioned earlier, a national ICT policy, ideally, that feeds into an ICT for Education sectoral plan, thinking about regulations, laws, and how those support your projects in the schools, or cannot be, underestimated. And I think last on the considerations is something that was raised earlier about avoiding the Matthew effects, which, for those of you who don't know, is the phenomenon of divisions becoming wider, the advantage becoming more advantaged, and the disadvantage becoming more disadvantaged. So we want to make sure with IT that we don't exacerbate those divides. Just wanted a quick snapshot of our current programs at ADB that incorporate ICT4E. We've been involved with the USP in a partnership that looks at campus development, and we've been doing some IT equipment upgrades, EMIS support, and curriculum alignment that was converted to the e-learning network. Samoa, you've heard about, and we will be doing some EMIS support work in the North Pacific in RMI and FSM. And then in the future pipeline, ADB is very interested in leveraging our hardware ICT cable work in the region. So wherever we have ICT cable work, as in Solomon Islands, we'll be doing technical assistance to ensure that that effort gets leveraged in terms of applications to the social services sector. So in Solomon Islands, we'll be looking at ICT for better education. We'll be helping the ministry there toward a national plan development, and we'll be piloting some activities for education management and teaching and learning. These will be in 3 districts throughout Solomon Islands. We also will have upcoming cable projects which are currently under development process in Samoa and Palau. And in both of those countries, we'll be looking at potential support with application toward the social services sector.